You build any application over a certain size, like 10 lines of code, you'll end up with the desire to configure it, to have that thing be configured at runtime, or to change its behavior without having to rewrite it, right? And there's all kinds of behavior that we want to modify. We want to modify the credentials that we provide to a mail server and a mail app. We want to change the secrets that some app has when it does encryption. We want to change settings and flags. That's when you go into your phone and you set the preferences maybe on the font size, or you want the formatter to work differently in your IDE. You're building something, but backend services have this a lot, where you need to configure, what endpoint you're running against in the dev environment versus a test environment versus production, unless you test only in production, in which case you've only got two, right? You've got encryption keys, or the secret required to connect to the encryption key. One of the configuration things we have is, what identity am I running under? And that can be managed in different ways. Diagnostic keys, what are the tracing identifiers we use for this app, so we can trace across multiple tiers or multiple calls, in a large application environment, especially when you get like the high priests of microservices. You end up trying to figure out, the tracing environment you've got and which system is identified as what is like super important. So the question is, if we're going to drive behavior with configuration, okay, so that we can be flexible with these apps, or we want to do A/B testing, we're going to roll out an app and then enable and disable features based on user feedback. How do we do that? And there's basically 3 times that we can do that. We can do it at build deploy time, so we basically create some kind of bundle that's got configuration in it already. We can do it on startup, so that's externalizing from the deployment bundle what the preferences are, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the other one is in flight, and so that's the app's running for some period of time, and it picks up changes in the environment or in the configuration that you gave it over time. And a good example would be something like, I'm doing A/B testing, or I'm doing 5% of the users get this new feature. We move the button around and 5% of the people get that, and the other 95% get the old behavior. And then over time, we migrate that to 100%. And I've seen it where we do, like, everybody whose last name begins with F is the people that get to be the guinea pigs. And then after that works, we'll start to roll it out to other people. And so the question is, how do we do that, right? We have the build and deploy time, we've got on startup, and then we've got in flight. And those kind of overlap. On startup and in flight, we can use some of the same techniques, right? We could put the configuration in a place on startup that changes, and we pick it up. And then there's basically, on a running app, there's basically, or any kind of application, there's basically 2 models, a push model and a pull model. And the push model, well, we'll talk about pull first. That's basically, on a regular basis, the application goes somewhere and it picks up settings, or it picks it up on startup. Hey, it's startup time. I'm going to go find out what my environment is, right? And then the other one would be push. It's a running application, or it's not yet running, and we're going to force feed the settings to that application on execution, or after it's running, we will inject or push configuration settings into it. So let's talk about this. Build and deploy. What are the big 2 for build and deploy are hard-coded and bundled assets, right? We can hard-code the app, have no configuration at all, and just force a rebuild. And if you're doing that, you can just stop listening right now. And then we have bundled assets, right? And even if you're only in a kind of playing with your own stuff, a lot of times you start doing, actually hard-coded would be like, I have a bunch of pound defines, or I have a bunch of constants in my app, and I'm super smart so that, I can just change that constants file, right? That's like a pretty common one. And then you have bundled assets. That's where you take those constant file, and you put it into like a JSON or a .properties or something else that fits on the platform you're on. And, and maybe what you do is you bundle a different one. Oh, we're in dev mode, and so these are the dev endpoints, and we build a custom iOS app, and then in production, for the production app, we'd use a different set of assets for the production endpoints that get bundled with, like in the Android app in the release mode. I'm trying to be inclusive here. And then the other one that happens at build deploy time is identity. Do you bake in an identity, right, into the deployable asset? Typically what you'll do is you'll do an identity on startup, and so somehow you have to give that an identity, and there are different ways to do that. It's like in the Azure space, you can actually, there's a identity service that's available on a local network only to the processes on that in that runtime, and so you can actually have the cloud configure the identity for that's coughed up by that service, and then anything running in that instance picks up that identity, right? So that's actually a way to do a pull. Well, I don't know if it's, anyway, that's the way to do startup, right? Like to pick up identity on startup. And then another one would be environment variables on startup, right? So you can set an environment, you can start an application, and it picks it up. Typically with environment variables, those can't be changed, so they can only be used on startup. Another one would be runtime or command line arguments. These are basically execution arguments. Dash dash for both would be a flag. Dash O, the output file in a command line. Those kinds of things. You might set a logging level on the command line. And that's something that can be done on startup, right? And you can kind of think of command line arguments as a push, right? Like I ran this with these things. I didn't run it and have it read the environment. So those two function slightly differently, and we can make use of that later. The other ones you can do on startups is you can put the assets externally, and kind of in a way that config service we talked about before can do that. You'll also see that, like I'm going to hit a vault. I'm going to hit a vault would be a good example where I go and pick up some secrets from that vault, and they're external, and maybe on a regular basis I go in flight and I pick up those assets, right? And then another one would be a configuration service. So you can have an asset sitting in a file system somewhere, and you could have an asset like a service, and so that would be a configuration service. I guess I need to change and that could happen in flight, or it could happen on startup, right? So then we have some that only work when you're on in-flight, and those are the push model. In a lot of ways, you can only push something when it starts, right, or after it started. And so two of those, remember we had external assets. So on startup, we could read assets from a file system. We could read them from a blob store. We can read them from a service, right, from a configuration service. Once it's running, though, if we're not going to do pull, we're in flight and we want to change something, then you have to have a way to send a message or send data to that process that's running. A lot of times you could have ephemeral. And so basically I've got a bunch of functions, they expire after 5 minutes of runtime. And so every time they restart, I don't have to do in-flight, I could just do on startup, right? But if I have longer running processes where I need to make changes, the obvious one is an API endpoint. We did that for years in Java code where we would stand up an admin, bunch of admin endpoints in which you could authenticate to those. You could change the logging levels, you could change database properties proactively on an existing service. In the cattle and pets area, we probably would just kill that thing and let it restart, and it would reread the configuration. So that depends on kind of the ephemeral nature of your compute. Another one would be agents and listeners. Hey, we install an agent, a management agent in the machine or in the process or in the container, in the function. And well, functions probably you wouldn't do that, but then you could talk to the agent, right? And the agent would cause variables to change. And so we could do like A/B testing, something like Launch Darkly, but maybe not that, or maybe that. And we could put an agent in the app, and then that would push changes into it, and then we wouldn't have to count on the app actually polling. The only thing with push is if you kill an instance and restart it, you really want to start up with the exact same configuration it would have had if it had been running a while. And so a lot of times you'll do read on startup, and then you'll do push notifications to those. And it'll read the current global configuration, and then it'll pick up changes. So that's it. Tried to keep this, really short, and that didn't happen. So you can change the way your system behaves at build and deploy, at startup, or in flight, and you have a choice of push or pull models. I hope that's useful. If we need to talk about specific ones, leave me a note and I'll write something up.